What if the game they played doesn't exist anymore? What if the style, the violence, the mentality that once defined Sundays would struggle to survive under today's rulebook? In Pittsburgh, football wasn't always about speed and spacing. It was about control, about dominance at the line of scrimmage, about defenders who hit first and asked questions later. For decades, the Steelers built their identity on players who didn't just adapt to the era, they embodied it. And as the league evolved, as rules changed and the game became faster and more cautious, some of those legends began to look like they were built for a different time entirely. Tonight, we're counting down 10 Steelers who were built for a different era. Players whose style, toughness, and mentality belonged to a version of football that hit harder, moved slower, and punished mistakes without hesitation. This isn't about saying today's NFL is soft. It's about recognizing how the game has changed and how certain players would have thrived even more in a different chapter of its history. Welcome to Black and Gold Legacy, where Steelers history isn't just remembered, it's relived with honesty and edge. If you respect real football conversations and the identity of the Black and Gold, hit like, subscribe, and share this with Steeler Nation. Because sometimes, greatness isn't about fitting the era you're in, it's about defining the one you were built for.
Number 10. Jerome Bettis. Before the league became obsessed with speed and spread formations, football was about imposing your will. Jerome Bettis didn't just run the ball, he delivered a message every time he lowered his shoulder. At over 250 pounds, he was built like a freight train, and his game reflected it. Patience behind the line, one decisive cut, then impact. In today's NFL, where offenses revolve around quick passes and space, a back like Bettis would likely see fewer touches, rotated in for specific packages rather than serving as the heartbeat of the offense. But in the 1980s and early 1990s, when run-heavy systems defined success and wearing down a defense was the strategy, Bettis would have thrived even more. His style belonged to an era where physical punishment wasn't just accepted, it was expected. That's why he begins this list at number 10, not because he wasn't dominant in his time, but because his brand of football was tailor-made for a version of the league that valued power over pace. He wasn't built for finesse, he was built for collision, and that identity makes him the perfect starting point for this countdown.
Number 9. Joey Porter. Joey Porter didn't just rush the passer, he hunted him. In a modern NFL that carefully monitors quarterback contact and taunting, Porter's playing style would constantly flirt with penalty flags. He played with visible emotion, with confrontation, with a belief that intimidation was part of the job description. Today's league emphasizes discipline and restraint. Porter built his career on edge and fire. That's not to say he couldn't play in today's game. His 98 career sacks prove he had the skill. But the era he thrived in allowed for a certain attitude that matched his personality perfectly. In the early 2000s, especially in heated AFC North rivalries, his physical finishes and sideline intensity set the tone for entire games. Quarterbacks felt his presence not just in the pocket, but before the snap even began. He wasn't simply trying to make the play, he was trying to make a statement. That kind of emotional edge defined his era. In today's tighter rule environment, it would constantly be under scrutiny. That's why he ranks here. Not because he lacked discipline, but because the version of football he embodied was raw, confrontational, and unapologetically physical, traits that belonged to a different time.
Number 8. Greg Lloyd. Before you saw the hit, you felt the stare. Greg Lloyd didn't just line up at linebacker. He brought a presence that made offenses uneasy before the ball was even snapped. In today's NFL, where celebrations are regulated and unnecessary roughness is closely monitored, Lloyd's edge would constantly be under the microscope. He played with visible intensity, with a style that bordered on intimidation as much as execution. That's part of why he ranks here. Not because he couldn't adapt to modern schemes, but because his brand of football thrived in an era that embraced confrontation. In the early 1990s, especially in physical AFC Central matchups, Lloyd's sacks weren't gentle takedowns. They were forceful reminders that the pocket wasn't safe. He didn't just beat blockers, he overwhelmed them. Modern defensive standards reward control and discipline above all. Lloyd's era rewarded dominance and psychological warfare just as much. He was built for a time when defensive players were expected to set the emotional tone of the game. That combination of physicality and visible edge makes him one of the clearest examples of a player whose style aligned perfectly with a tougher, less restrained chapter of NFL history. Number 7, Donnie Shell. Donnie Shell didn't need a long run-up to make his presence known. He waited, he read, and when the moment came, he struck with precision that felt almost inevitable. In today's NFL, where defenseless receiver rules and helmet-to-helmet enforcement are central to the game, many of Shell's trademark middle-of-the-field collisions would be flagged immediately. That's exactly why he belongs on this list. His game was built for an era that allowed safeties to patrol the middle without hesitation, to deliver punishing hits the instant the ball arrived. In the Steel Curtain years, that physical authority wasn't controversial, it was expected. Shell wasn't reckless, he was calculated. He baited quarterbacks into throws and arrived with force that changed drives in a single snap. Modern football prioritizes player safety in ways that would limit that freedom. Shell thrived in a league that valued intimidation as part of defensive identity. That era fit him perfectly. He wasn't just covering space, he was protecting territory. And in a time when crossing routes carried real risk, Donnie Shell was one of the reasons why. Number 6, Hines Ward. Hines Ward played wide receiver the way linebackers were supposed to play defense. In a modern NFL built on protecting defenseless players and eliminating blindside contact, Ward's physical brand of football would constantly live under review. That's exactly why he fits this ranking. He wasn't just running routes and catching passes, he was hunting blocks, crackback hits, downfield collisions, plays that flipped momentum not because of a catch, but because of impact. In today's game, many of those blocks would draw immediate flags under blindside block rules and player safety emphasis. But in the era he thrived in, that toughness was celebrated. It was part of Steelers' identity. Ward embraced it. He took pride in delivering contact, not avoiding it. His style reflected a version of football that demanded receivers contribute physically, not just statistically. That era rewarded grit in every role on the field. Ward didn't just fit that culture, he embodied it. That's why he ranks here. Not because he was the most violent player, but because his complete, hard-nosed style belonged to a tougher chapter of the league. In a different era, one less restricted by today's safety framework, Hines Ward's brand of football would feel right at home. Number 5, James Harrison. James Harrison didn't just rush the passer, he punished him. Low pad level, explosive first step, relentless finish. His style was built on leverage and force, and in today's NFL, that combination constantly walks a tightrope. Modern roughing the passer rules, body weight restrictions, and heightened quarterback protection would turn many of Harrison's most violent finishes into flags or fines. In fact, late in his career, he became one of the most fined defenders in the league as the NFL tightened its enforcement around high and forceful contact. That tension between his physical identity and the evolving rulebook is exactly why he belongs here. Harrison thrived in an era that still allowed edge rushers to finish through the tackle and make quarterbacks feel every collision. His hits weren't reckless, they were disciplined and powerful, but the modern league prioritizes minimizing that kind of impact. In the 1980s or early 1990s, his style would have been even more celebrated, even less scrutinized. He wasn't built for moderation. He was built for trench warfare off the edge. That's why he ranks at number 5. Not because he lacked dominance in his time, but because the game around him changed, and he was crafted for a version of football that embraced his brand of violence more freely. Number 4, Troy Polamalu. You never really knew where Troy Polamalu was coming from. That was the fear. That was the brilliance. And that's why he fits this theme so perfectly. Polamalu thrived in chaos, reading the play before it developed, abandoning structure to trust instinct, and arriving at the ball with explosive force. In today's NFL, defensive assignments are tighter, coverage responsibilities are stricter, and one false step can expose a secondary instantly. But Polamalu was built for a freer version of football, one that rewarded instinct over rigidity. His downhill collisions weren't just tackles, they were statements. His timing was surgical. He didn't hit late, he hit exactly when it hurt the most. In an older era, where defensive creativity had fewer constraints and roaming safeties were given more latitude, his unpredictability would have been even more devastating. Modern schemes still allowed him to dominate, but they also limited how often he could fully unleash that chaos. That's why he ranks here. Not because he wasn't incredible in his time, but because his game, instinctive, violent, fearless, belonged to a version of football that embraced improvisation and contact more freely. Troy Polamalu wasn't just ahead of the snap, he was ahead of the era itself. Number 3. Mel Blount. When people talk about players being built for a different era, Mel Blount isn't just an example, he's the definition. At 6'3" with linebacker strength, Blount didn't just cover wide receivers, he controlled them. In the 1970s, physical press coverage was part of defensive identity, and Blount mastered it. He jammed receivers off the line, disrupted routes beyond 5 yards, and turned passing games into wrestling matches. Today, illegal contact penalties would limit that style almost immediately. In fact, his dominance was so overwhelming that the NFL introduced what became known as the Mel Blount rule in 1978, restricting defensive contact downfield. That rule change alone explains why he ranks this high. His game was perfectly suited for an era that allowed corners to impose their will without hesitation. Modern football prioritizes spacing and receiver freedom. Blount thrived in a version of the sport that demanded physical confrontation at the line. He wasn't just a great defensive back, he was built for a time when intimidation was legal and celebrated. And when the league has to rewrite the rulebook because of you, that's not just dominance, that's proof you belonged to a different era.
Number 2. Jack Lambert. Before targeting rules, before defenseless receiver protections, before the game softened its edges, there was Jack Lambert standing in the middle of the field, daring offenses to challenge him. Lambert wasn't built like the prototype linebacker of his era, leaner, almost wiry, but what he lacked in bulk, he made up for in timing and controlled violence. He read plays instantly and filled gaps with a force that stopped momentum cold. In today's NFL, many of his middle-of-the-field collisions would draw immediate flags under modern safety standards. That's why he ranks here. The game he thrived in allowed defenders to dictate the physical terms of engagement. Crossing routes carried real risk. Running backs braced themselves before contact. Lambert didn't just make tackles, he imposed presence. His style was fearless but disciplined, and that balance defined the 1970s Steelers defense. Modern football demands restraint and split-second adjustments to avoid penalties. Lambert played in a time when physical assertion was part of defensive identity. That era fit him perfectly. His toughness wasn't about recklessness, it was about conviction. He ruled the middle because the game allowed him to, and because he was built to. That's why he stands at number 2.
Number 1. Mean Joe Greene. If there was ever a player built for a different era, it was Mean Joe Greene. Before the Steelers were champions, before the banners hung high, Greene stood in the trenches and demanded something different. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't chasing highlight sacks. He was collapsing pockets before quarterbacks could finish their drop. He was destroying running plays at the point of attack. In the 1970s, when football was smash-mouth and run-heavy, interior dominance mattered more than it does in today's pass-first league. Modern football often prioritizes speed off the edge and coverage versatility. Greene thrived in a world where winning the line of scrimmage defined the outcome of the game. His game was about leverage, strength, and relentless physical pressure. In today's NFL, where quick releases and spread formations neutralize interior disruption, his value might not be as visible. But in his era, he was the foundation. The Steelers' transformation from struggling franchise to dynasty began with him anchoring the defensive front. He didn't just fit that era, he embodied it. His presence dictated how offenses played, how defenses fed off his energy, and how the city of Pittsburgh came to see itself on Sundays.
That's why he ranks number 1, not because he was simply the most violent, but because his entire style of dominance was perfectly aligned with a tougher, more trench-driven chapter of football history.
Every era of football has its own rhythm, its own rules, its own limits. But the players on this list weren't shaped by limits, they were shaped by toughness. They played in a time when contact was constant and hesitation was dangerous. Some would have thrived even more in an older, looser version of the game. Others forced the league to change around them. What never changed was the standard they represented. In Pittsburgh, physicality isn't a trend, it's a tradition. These weren't just hard hitters or dominant defenders. They were tone setters who embodied a version of football that doesn't fully exist anymore. Now I want to hear from you. Who on this list do you think was truly built for a different era? Did we rank them correctly, or would you move someone higher? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's keep the debate going. If you respect Steelers history and the legacy of the black and gold, hit like, subscribe, and share this with Steeler Nation. This is Black and Gold Legacy, where football isn't just remembered, it's relived.